I want to give a little bit of background here because one of my most recent books defining environmental justice is about the concept of justice in the environmental justice movement. And it looks at the way that the movement frames the notion of justice, or how it defines the notion of justice. And one of the things that I focus on there is the very broad conception of justice that exists in the movement, including this notion of capabilities, which is generally about what is necessary for individuals and communities to function and to live their lives as they hope to. So the task of this particular talk is pretty straightforward. I want to apply this framework that I developed for environmental justice and place it on climate justice and explore how a capabilities approach to justice can be applied specifically to a conception of climate justice. So there are a number of claims here. The first is that in the climate justice literature, there is a move, or has been a move, away from solely equity-based notions of climate justice towards environmental rights and toward development rights. And I want to expand on that a little bit. I think they're important because they start to focus on people's everyday lives and what it takes to live a life under climate change. The second thing I'm claiming here is that this notion of climate justice based in capabilities can really accommodate a wide range of claims that comes out of the climate justice movement, the way that they're articulating what the problem is in terms of vulnerabilities of communities. And then the third argument is that we need to move beyond a strictly human bias in considerations of climate justice. And I argue that a capabilities approach can be applied to both what human communities and non-human communities need in order to function. And so it's a broader theory of justice that's applicable to the multiple impacts of climate change. Okay, so the talk has to begin with a little bit of background. I'll talk a little bit about recent theories of climate justice. I'll then define and talk a little bit about what capabilities is. Capabilities theory is developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And then I'll talk a bit about the climate justice movement before getting into a couple of key ways that a capabilities approach can move beyond this focus on humans alone. Okay. Now, Peter Singer, when he gave his first talk in this series, talked a bit about recent theories of climate justice, and I don't want to repeat a lot of that stuff. I just want to sort of contrast some of these efforts with a capability-based way of thinking about climate justice. So a lot of discussions of climate justice are focused on historical responsibility. Right? The focus is that there are specific actors and specific practices that have brought us to our current position. And those are the folks that have developed, are the ones that should pay for their past and present transgressions. So it's basically a polluter pays principle that puts the burden squarely on the long industrialized nations. Now, clearly there are a number of critiques of that approach. One is that it may just be the case that some of these actors didn't really know what they were doing when they were doing it. They didn't understand what the consequences were, and so it's unfair to place the full burden on folks. That changes, obviously, in the 80s or 90s, depending on your point of view. So a number of folks criticize this notion for being a bit too backward-looking and for not being very politically pragmatic, but you can use this sort of not politically pragmatic argument for just about any notion of climate justice. But still, it's a distributive principle. Those that created the problem should pay for the solution. Probably the most popular approach to climate justice right now is the argument that Singer made last term, and it's also an argument that Dale Jamieson has made. And they suggest a theory of climate justice that's based in current equity rather than in past responsibility. And the argument is to give everyone an equal slice of the greenhouse gas emission pie. And I think Peter Singer actually used a picture of a pie to explain that. That's my favorite pie chart, is actually a picture of a pie. The argument is to give everyone a share, an equal share of the capacity of the atmospheric sink, as he puts it. So you come up with a scientific agreement on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we can continue to allow. You then divide that amount by the total world population, and the result would be a per capita emissions allowance for each person on the planet. and then each country would be allowed to emit the per capita times their population. Singer supplements this with a cap-and-trade system whereby countries that go beyond their per capita allowance can buy permits from those that don't. In essence, it results in both, or ideally it results in lower emissions overall and then compensation for less developed nations who use less than the per capita share. So it would require both equitable consideration, but also the kind of payment that folks who argued for the historical principle would argue for. Okay, now, there are a number of critiques of the per capita idea. Some folks argue it's an incentive to increase population. Singer responds to this pretty clearly by saying you just use a number from the past or you use a UN projection one way or the other. It's also been called politically unrealistic, but again, folks say that about every notion of climate justice. My own particular critique of the per capita approach, however, is that it doesn't take into consideration the different needs of people living in varied places. It's in its equal distribution of emission shares, differences of place are simply dismissed. And I think Singer actually said some people just shouldn't be living in certain areas north and in the tropics. I think the capabilities approach offers a better response to this fact of people living in different places. Now, while the per capita argument has really become most popular, there are still some other approaches that focus more on rights, environmental rights, and development rights. So Simon Caney actually developed a notion of environmental rights where people have a right not to suffer from climate impacts that undermine their basic interests. So crucially, individuals also have the burden, the duty, the responsibility associated with protecting that right of others. So Caney's proposed climate justice model, like the per capita model, insists that we have a duty not to exceed a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but that duty is based on our duty not to violate the rights of others. Right? If we do exceed our quota and we do violate the environmental rights of others, we then have a duty to compensate those whose rights were violated. A more specific rights-based approach is the development rights framework, and that's been offered by Paul Bauer, Tom Athanasiou, and Sivan Kartha, who gave another one of the talks last term and who I had an interesting conversation with just a few days ago. This framework is designed not only to stabilize climate change, but also to preserve the right of people to reach a dignified level of sustainable human development free of the privation of poverty. So the idea of the development rights approach is to protect a basic level of development, what they call a development threshold, for all individuals and nations, while charging countries that develop beyond that basic level. So a climate payment would be made to the global poor to enable both the development of the less disabled or the less developed, as well as the capacity of the global system to respond to climate crisis. Now, one of the things that's really promising about the development rights framework is that it does begin to move beyond just a notion of equity, to start to focus on what it is that individuals and communities and states need to develop and function. Now, the problem I have with the development rights framework is that they operationalize this notion of a development framework in cash terms alone. It's 125% of the global poverty level. So that's the development threshold. So it's a single payment scheme, and it doesn't really focus on what the specific capabilities are other than just cash for communities and countries to develop. Now, most recently, Steve Vanderheiden has combined the ideas of Caney and ecoequity and others, and he's developed this notion of climate justice that's based in both environmental and in development rights. So here, the development right argument is rearticulated as a right to have the basic environment in which human flourishing is possible, and that includes a stable climate system. Vanderheiden claims that that basic environmental and development rights trump other claims that are less basic to flourishing. So those that have developed are required not only not to impede others, but also to pay the full costs of their luxury. Now, my point in laying out this really brief history of climate justice literature is simply to note that these approaches, these more recent approaches of eco-equity and van der Heyden, begin to conceptualize climate justice beyond this notion of equity. They really begin to address what is needed in terms of environmental conditions and development conditions to survive, to function, to develop as human beings. Right? The focus is on what it is about climate change that makes our lives more vulnerable and how a notion of climate justice can most directly address that vulnerability. Now, what I want to argue is that the capabilities approach gives us a much more thorough way to think about these things than these notions that I've talked about so far. Okay. Now, the other thing is that the approach also fits with climate justice movements, and I'll come back to that. But let me talk a bit about the capabilities approach itself. So Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum developed a theory of justice that focuses on the capacities that are necessary for individuals to fully function in their chosen lives. Right? The central argument of the capabilities approach is that we should judge just arrangements not simply in distributive terms, but more particularly in how those distributions affect our well-being and how we function. So the focus isn't just on the distribution of goods. It's more particularly on how those goods are transformed into the flourishing of individuals and communities. So Sen says the focus has to be on the freedoms generated by commodities, not on the commodities seen on their own. Nussbaum says we ask not just about the resources that are sitting around, but how those do or do not go to work, enabling us to function in a fully human way. So capabilities looks at what is needed to transform primary goods, if they're available, into a fully functioning life. And importantly, what it is that interrupts that process of the transfer from goods to fully functioning lives. And the key to the approach and the notion of justice that Nussbaum argues is the desire to see each thing flourish as the sort of thing that it is. And so this theory of justice gives this ethical significance to our functioning and our flourishing and finds harm in the limiting of that. Now, there are differences between Sen and Nussbaum in their accounts of capabilities. Sen's original focus was to broaden the way that quality of life assessments are done, going beyond income into a range of other indicators, and this is most obviously manifest in the Human Development Reports of the UNDP. Sen is, I want to say stubbornly, but that's not right. Sen is insistent on remaining rather vague about what particular capabilities agents should have to enable their own functioning. He notes some basic concepts and freedoms that help advance general capability of people: political freedoms, economic facilities, social opportunities, transparency guarantees, and protective security. He's less interested in developing his own set because he wants to see public reason and deliberation used, a community-based approach used for folks to develop their own notions, their own specific contextual capability sets. Now, Nussbaum, on the other hand, doesn't have that kind of hesitation, because Nussbaum's purpose in laying out capabilities is to lay out a foundation for basic political principles, basic political rights. She wants constitutional guarantees for these capabilities. So she defends what she calls a basic capability set that's necessary for functioning. So this includes life for being able to live a life of normal length. Bodily health includes food and shelter. Bodily integrity means being able to move about freely, being free from assault and abuse. Senses, imagination, and thought includes the freedom to express emotion and the right to an adequate education. Emotions means having attachments to things, to love, to grieve, to experience longing, gratitude, and justified anger. Practical reason is this classic liberal goal of developing one's own definition of the good life. Affiliation is living with others in some sort of meaningful social interaction, having the social basis of self-respect and non-humiliation. Other species means living with and having a concern for the natural world. Play needs no explanation. And control over one's environment, by which she means both material control and political control. And so Nussbaum argues that these particular capabilities, based in constitutional principles and rights, would provide for the social and political bases the development of a fully functioning life. Now, one of the things I like about the capability approach, for those that are interested in theories of justice, is that it's broadly encompassing. So not only does it deal with notions of distribution, but it also addresses those that are concerned with procedural justice, both Sen and Nussbaum interested in procedural justice. And Nussbaum especially encompasses theories of recognition. Axel Honneth, Iris Young, Nancy Fraser talk about recognition, social recognition, as a crucial element of justice. It's in here as different capabilities. Now, the other thing I wanted to say about the capabilities approach is that a lot of climate justice principles don't address the very specific capabilities that we need to live. Even the environmental rights approach just focuses on sort of the broad notions of a stable climate system as central to a functioning life. But the capabilities approach to climate justice, I think, addresses very specific ways that environment supports human capabilities, and I'll come back to that. But in addition to making theoretical sense, the argument here is that a capabilities approach to climate justice can encompass the demands of climate justice movements. Now, I've made the argument elsewhere that in order to fully understand the conception of justice in the environmental justice movement, we really have to look at the types of demands, the type of language and discourses that come out of movement organizations. Now, like environmental justice, the justice of climate justice, as articulated by movements, includes not only equity, but also notions of recognition and authentic political participation. And a focus on the demands of movement groups also illustrates a concern with a wide range of capabilities, and importantly, this notion of functioning. So a lot of statements that come out of the climate justice movement illustrate this general concern that global climate change will impact everyday life and reduce people's ability to sustain themselves, both individually and community. So activists in the movement talk about the most basic thing is protecting vulnerable communities and what it takes for these communities to function. You see this in the indigenous environmental movement, which is really sort of coming up with a list of the impacts on the ability of indigenous nations to reproduce themselves. Activists in New Orleans talk about the same thing, what it takes for the community to function. But there are also a number of very specific capabilities. So clearly, in climate justice movements, one of the key concerns is public health. The health impacts of climate change and how they're going to impact vulnerable communities. This includes the impacts of increased heat in a lot of cities, the increase in severe weather events, increased diseases, decreased food security, the mental health impacts of climate change as well. Environmental refugees being impacted by a number of these, and also environmental refugees being a burden to communities' public health systems. Bodily integrity is another capability that the movement addresses, but at the community level, not just at the individual one. So before Katrina, environmental justice organizations in New Orleans were focusing more on sort of individual public health, right? The impact of what's known as Cancer Alley, petrochemical manufacturing and oil refining in Cancer Alley. They were focused on the impact on individual health. After Katrina, there was a recognition of the impact of sort of the broader use of these industries on the integrity of the community as a whole, meaning what's coming in from the ocean in terms of a storm. Another capability that comes up is recognition, right? The recognition of vulnerable communities and impacted communities, indigenous communities, small island states, in addition to the poor and black of New Orleans. That's central to activist notions of climate justice. So it's not just that some folks are more vulnerable than others, it's that that vulnerability in those people aren't recognized and respected. And related to that, there are any number of calls for participation, recognition of participation in political decision-making about climate justice. And if you look at any NGO list of climate justice demands, public participation is absolutely central. It's in every single one of these lists from Bali to the recent Environmental Justice Coalition. And again, it clearly relates to some of the capabilities in Sen and Nussbaum. Now finally, when it comes to climate justice and movements, it's clear that the focus is not just on individual capabilities. but it's on communities as well. It's on community functioning and not just individual functioning. So there's a real jump in the way that climate justice movements understand justice, in not just the individual form, but in a collective form as well. And the focus is clearly on community functioning, right? That's as much the issue. Okay, so the argument so far is that a capabilities approach to justice can encompass and clarify a number of recent innovations in climate justice theory and the bands of movements. But another related argument is that the theory of climate justice needs to extend the notion of capabilities and the theory of capabilities itself in a way that more fully lays out and addresses the capabilities necessary for both human and non-human systems to flourish. So I want to lay out how we can revise the theory in two different ways. So on the one hand, we can focus on the work that natural systems do and sort of the proper functioning as a necessary, proper functioning of natural systems is necessary for human capabilities in function. So we can see functioning environmental systems as one of the factors in a human capability set. The second way we can extend the capabilities approach is to push the theory to focus on the functioning of natural systems in and of themselves, right? To look at the capabilities necessary for their own flourishing, distinct from human needs. Now, the first argument, extending capabilities when it comes to human beings, can do a lot of the work, both in terms of climate justice in the natural world, and there are all kinds of arguments against extending justice to nature, and we can talk about those, but I think it's important to lay out this argument anyway. Okay. So first, we can extend a capabilities approach to address the fact that human capabilities are supported by natural systems. Right? This extends and clarifies the environmental rights approach. It extends the development rights approach as well to encompass the demands of the movement and offer specifics about what is environmentally necessary to develop or to have a fully functioning life. Now here, even there are two particular strategies. We can either flesh out the environmental implications of existing capabilities, or we can develop a new capability, a new environmental capability. So we can make an argument, on the one hand, that a lot of Nussbaum's capabilities depend on a stable environment. Right? Climate changes will have an impact on a number of those capabilities, as illustrated by the discourses of the movement. People's ability to have a life of a normal length, capability of bodily health will be threatened by heat-related stresses, the expansion of diseases, the impacts of severe climatic events on agriculture and shelter. Climate change will impact the ability of many to move freely, right, making them climate refugees. There's emotional grief and loss, ecosystems linked to sort of aesthetic notions that a number of cultural perspectives have could be lost. This sort of impacts Nussbaum's notion of senses, imagination, thought. And then, obviously, other species are impacted by climate change, and it impacts our ability to have some sort of meaningful interaction or meaningful relationship with the natural world. And this gets at the focus that we have on polar bears on ice floes. So it seems clear that we can broaden our interpretation of the capabilities already laid out in order to understand how they're supported by environmental factors and develop a notion of climate justice around that. Okay, so that's a relatively straightforward avenue. But Ed Page and Brina Holland have both suggested going beyond these existing capabilities and suggest the development of a new, independent environmental capability. So Page suggests a capability to experience life in an environment devoid of dangerous environmental impacts such as those associated with climate change. Well, that's pretty straightforward. Right? Such a capability would include a safe and hospitable environment as a vital ingredient of a decent life. So just add one to the list. Holland goes a different route. So simply adding a capability misses an important realization. She argues that without accounting for the importance of functioning ecological systems and how they enable all of the other capabilities, Nussbaum simply fails to identify what's actually necessary to achieve justice. So Holland argues for what she calls a meta-capability that enables all the others. And so she labels this new capability sustainable ecological capacity. And that is being able to live one's life in the context of ecological conditions that can provide environmental resources and services that enable all of these other capabilities. And then she makes an argument for an environmental justice threshold. Right? That's the level at which ecological systems could support not only themselves, but also the basic capabilities of humans in the system. Okay? So both of these are extensions, reasonable extensions of Nussbaum. Right? If the capabilities approach is about flourishing, and we flourish in particular environments, flourishing for human beings means providing for those ecological support systems that make our functioning possible. Right? Now, the second thing, the final argument really that I want to make, is that there's another way to extend the capabilities approach beyond reference to humans alone into a consideration to the capabilities necessary for the non-human natural world to function. So the argument here is that we can apply capabilities to non-human animals and ecosystems without any reference to them as supporting human systems. The question really is whether we can see a notion of climate justice not just as a notion of environmental justice, but of ecological justice as well, or justice to nature. Now, Nussbaum has done something really interesting here. She's directly addressed the application of the capabilities approach to animals, right? Some part of non-human nature. Now, it's not focused on climate justice, but she breaks crucial ground by arguing that an approach to justice, a capabilities approach, is applicable to a wide range of types of sentience and dignity and of the needs for the flourishing of animals. It's plausible, she says, to think about our relations with animals as regulated by a conception of justice. And that's a huge step for justice theorists. And a number of authors have offered this sort of idea of expanding the conception of justice beyond the human community. And the focus there is to really look at what it is that we share with the rest of nature, as opposed to what differentiates us from the rest of nature, which is what most theory does. So Nussbaum, for example, focuses on the concept of dignity. And this is something that human beings share with sentient animals. Right? Each form of life, she says, humans and some animals, should have the opportunity to flourish and to live a life with dignity. Now, her point is to extend a notion of justice only to the most sentient of animals, but to extend the notion of justice nonetheless. Now, I don't think dignity is really the most apt term to focus on, or apt quality, mostly because it's primarily a psychological term referring to self-respect. There are some connotations there that are problematic when we're talking about nature. Now, there are a number of other ecological theorists that have focused on another crucial quality of the essence of life that we share with other beings, and that's integrity. Right? So it's the impairment of the integrity of a life. In other words, the interruption of its ability to function at a living entity that's key. So that gets us away from the individual psychology of animals and gets us to something much more tied with everyday living and functioning. Now, integrity is also something that's key to understanding climate justice, because it's the physical integrity of human beings, human communities, non-human animals, and ecosystems that are now vulnerable to climate change. Now, the second limitation of Nussbaum's extension of justice is that it applies only to individual animals. And she justifies this focus by saying that, for example, damage to the species occurs through damage to individuals. Now, of course, that's really problematic. Damage to species occurs mostly through loss of habitat, through damage to ecological support systems and symbiotic relationships, and in a larger sense, damage to ecosystems as a whole. So it's the functioning of natural systems, not an individual, which is at the heart of something like species extinctions. And certainly, it's at the heart of something like climate change. The integrity and functioning of whole ecosystems are at risk. So that really, unfortunately, is the crucial essence of being that we share with other parts of nature due to climate change, the vulnerability of our integrity of human communities, natural communities. So my argument here is that the capabilities approach could enrich conceptions of climate justice by bringing recognition to the functioning of natural systems, as well as the individuals within them, both human and non-human. So here, the central issue of climate justice is the interruption of the capabilities and the functioning of living systems. What keeps living systems from transforming primary goods into the functioning and flourishing of both human and non-human individuals and their various ecosystems? So in other words, the capabilities approach could be extended way beyond what Page and Holland offer, attention to the way that human capabilities are dependent on natural systems, to one that also focuses on the fact that those natural relationships and processes also supply functioning to animals and ecosystems. So it's a simple point, if a controversial one. There's no theoretical reason to limit the notion of capabilities to individual human beings, and ecological reasons for extending it to systems as well as individual animals. Now, I also think this approach and language is mirrored in the science surrounding climate change. Right? The UNFCCC was about stabilizing greenhouse gases to, quote, prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So the perceived wrong is the interference with and the disruption of the functioning of a natural system. Right? Following up on that, the IPCC reports have focused on a number of risks to unique and threatened systems: hydrological systems, terrestrial ecosystems, marine and freshwater systems, polar high mountain communities and ecosystems. I think this more natural systems-based approach helps us make sense of a lot of the arguments used in the environmental community and the climate science community and ecological restorationists in their attempts to defend nature by using concepts like resilience and systems integrity. Okay? Because the focus there is on the impediments to nature's own capabilities to fully and continually function. So I think a systems-based approach helps us flesh out exactly what the moment of injustice is in this principle. It's the point where nature is deprived of the capability to function. It offers an opportunity to more specifically define what capabilities particular systems need. Okay, so in understanding the injustice of climate justice this way, we can then turn our focus to the various social and cultural, industrial, and institutional meanings and processes that deny particular capabilities and how those prevent the natural functioning of systems. I also think that this type of capabilities approach, especially using Sen and Nussbaum's varied focus on deliberation and participatory rights, can allow for the kind of participation, procedure, flexibility, and local knowledge that is crucial to accomplish systems functioning and also meet the participatory demands of climate justice movements. Now, clearly there are a number of substantive critiques of extending justice, no matter how you define it, to nature. We can discuss those later. But I do think that the development of a conception of climate justice based in human capabilities and functioning and the environment needed for those, the sort of first notion of extending capabilities, may be enough. And I may be willing to stop there. But as the line goes, crises are also an opportunity. And I think there's an opportunity to think much more broadly about climate justice in a way that focuses not just on human animals, but in a way that extends the notion to non-human nature as well. Clearly, there's a lot more to think about here. Okay, so the argument is that one way or another, the capabilities approach to justice can help us rethink and reframe the discussion of climate justice. So rather than focus on individual per capita permits, we can look much more thoroughly at what individuals and their communities need to fully function as individuals and communities. The approach can encompass existing climate justice frameworks of development and environmental rights, extending those to look much more specifically at the capabilities that are necessary for people and communities to function and thrive. It also addresses, as I said, the needs and demands of climate justice movement groups who are often very separate from the ideas of climate justice theorists. I think the capabilities approach to climate justice allows for a much more pluralistic and broad-based understanding of functioning, and it helps us to differentiate among the needs of very different communities in different parts of the world. And crucially, it remains focused on the essence of climate change and our response to it, which is providing the conditions necessary for both natural systems and human systems to properly function. Thanks.
Everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Before.
Steve, can you use the microphone?
Oh, sure, because you want to.
For the videotape.
Yeah. Now, can everybody hear me? All right. Now, before reading David's background paper on this and interacting with him, I thought that the climate justice movement, I think correctly thought, that the climate justice movement was preoccupied by the issue of mitigation. That is, who's going to pay for all the emissions reductions? All right? We're rich. We put all this stuff into the atmosphere. Everybody's got to reduce the emissions reductions. There's a problem with the development of poverty, the story goes. And so what we've got to do somehow is not commit additional injustice when we right this problem. All right? But one of the things I like about the capabilities approach is that it gives equal or even greater weight, because of its breadth, to the problem of adaptation to climate change, as well as to the problem of mitigation of climate change. Now, as a scientist, I can tell you that the sad fact is that we've let this problem go too long, all right? The Earth has within it long time-scale time lags. The CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution has only accomplished a minority of the climate change that it will. And it's because it takes a long time, for instance, for it to warm up the deep oceans to equilibrium. So even if we stopped emitting now, we still have a lot of climate change to go. And sadly, since we're already seeing impacts now, we have a lot of adaptation that people are going to have to do. And the people that are least able to do that adaptation are, of course, the poor and the vulnerable and the people who live in the wrong district in New Orleans and that sort of thing. So I like the approach because it gives weight to adaptation, and that's simply the reality of the problem that we're having to deal with. The other thing that I like about it is that in being as broad as it is, it gives a lot of focus and keeps front and center the notion of ecosystem and ecological services, that we have to protect those. And as a scientist, I can tell you that these ecological services keep me up at night worrying about them, all right? What happens is that when the climate changes, some of these ecological services begin to deteriorate. And sadly, some of them have feedbacks, cause additional climate change, which causes them to deteriorate further, and you can get into a spin cycle that is bad for us all. One of the ones that some people, Elena Shevlyakova and others in my laboratory, have come up with recently from a climate model that we run here at Princeton and GFDL, is that if we try to shoot for what used to be thought of as a decent target for mitigation, never allowing the atmospheric CO2 to more than double from what it was before the Industrial Revolution, if we were to do that, then what happens is that the boreal ecosystems and tropical rainforests begin to degrade at such a rate that they dump extra CO2 into the atmosphere, an amount roughly equal to what's in the atmosphere already, doubling the problem and causing a runaway that, of course, would be very, very bad. Rob and I coined a unit of climate mitigation called a wedge. Some of you know that we needed 8 wedges to solve the climate problem over the next 40 years. This mechanism dumps an extra 26 into the atmosphere, all right, which really would put everything horribly out of reach. So the need to protect other parts of the planet, in addition maybe to being good ethics, is also sensible from a selfish perspective. But one of the things I don't like about the climate justice is that, and this may be too harsh, okay, but I still am going to try that anyway. It's at least true of the capabilities approach. One of the things I don't like about it is that I think, like many other problems that are in the environmental arena, there's a tendency to bundle issues together that might be separated, all right? Now, the advantage of separating issues is often that you find solutions that are unconstrained by the other issue. And so oftentimes it's good to separate issues when you can. And I think this may be true to a more significant extent than we normally think about of the issue, of the twin issues of poverty alleviation and climate mitigation, okay? Now, this is a figure that I think I stole from you, Rob. And it simply shows why it is that if you're going to solve the carbon problem, you've got to deal with the poor as well. They emit, non-OECD countries emit more than OECD countries. Proposed targets for mitigation. This is the one that the IPCC and a lot of European countries say that we need to do, never allow the climate to change globally more than 2 degrees Celsius. This is one that a lot of green organizations talk about, 450 parts per million CO2 as a maximum. This is one Rob and I talked about in the Wedge's paper. We used to talk about 550. Nobody does anymore. To achieve these targets, the answer has some slop in it, but it's roughly, you need a huge emissions reduction of both rich and poor nations to achieve this one. You need a big reduction, radical decarbonization of rich nations, and still a moderate decarbonization of poor nations. And to do this one, you need still radical decarbonization of the rich nations, but you can allow some emissions growth in the poor. Now, these are the two that are really in play now. This is the one that's behind a lot of the proposals that are before the U.S. government. This is behind some of the others. And you can see that the difference between the two is how much the poor nations have to do. All right? And so what we're talking about is trading off damages to them and us against how much they have to do now when they're trying to develop. Now, these are some of the different concepts of climate justice that were talked about today. Don't have the historical one. I'll get back to that. Singer and Jameson, everybody gets the same emissions allowance, right to reach a dignified level of development, right to prevent your future development from being impeded by the actions of others. All of these speak directly to issues of poverty. Capabilities I've already talked about. Now, this is a figure that was produced primarily by Shoaib Chakravarti and also a whole bunch of other people, including, well, a lot of people in this room. I only kibitzed on some of the technical details. But for those of you who haven't seen it, I want to sort of walk you through it because I think it says a huge amount about the separability of the poverty problem and the climate problem. Now, what this is a lineup of people from the least emitting over there to the most emitting person in the world, the 6.2 billionth most emitting person. So this is the biggest emitter, and that's the smallest. This is some hunter-gatherer someplace, and I'd really like to know who this person is. We're all probably out there with them, all right? But nonetheless. Well, Al Gore is a candidate, maybe. Now, the curve is something you won't be used to, and it's the cumulative emissions of everybody to your left, all right? So we go here to the 3 billionth emitter, and it says the 3 billion lowest emitters altogether emit 500 million metric tons of carbon, all right? The whole globe, all 6.25 billion, at least in this year, emitted about 7. Okay, so you see how that works? This means everybody to your left, all 3 billion of the lowest emitters put together, you put them all together, and they emit 500 million of the 7 billion. So half of humanity is doing roughly 1/15 of the damages. Okay, just a few percent of the damages. Another way to look at this is to look at this spot out here, halfway up. How many people are responsible for half the emissions? Well, it's the 5.5 billion lowest emitters all put together, or the 500 to 700 million highest emitters put together. So all the emissions are aggregated into those few really profligate people here at the high end. Now, who are those people? Well, lo and behold, this axis is also almost exactly an axis of how rich you are, how much money you make. Rich people are the only ones who can afford the stuff that emits, all right? So this is a problem very much of the rich causing it, not the poor. One of the things about permitting that would pay the poor for emissions permits for the rich is those payments, however rightly and sort of nobly motivated, wouldn't actually reduce emissions very much because the poor don't have any emissions to begin with, you see? Now, in addition, imagine that you were emperor of the world, and you could say, I'm sick of this problem. Poverty is much more important than climate mitigation, and what I want to do now is alleviate poverty. And the way I'm going to do it is with the brownest technology, no green development mechanism. I'm going to do a brown development mechanism. I'm going to put a diesel generator in every village and give people basic electricity and cooking and transport, all right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise everybody in the world up to the medianth person. I'm going to raise their income and raise their emissions up to the medianth person. Now, the point is that if you did that, you increase the mitigation problem only a little bit because these people, the medianth person, doesn't emit very much. So you can actually solve the poverty problem in that sense without making a significant impact on the problem of mitigating the carbon dioxide emissions, because you can raise somebody up to the average person and still they won't emit very much. All the emissions are done by all of us out here at this end. So I think that this problem is almost separable in the sense that you could solve the poverty problem almost without worrying about the climate problem. And you could solve the climate problem, perhaps, without worrying too much about the poverty problem. And so maybe there are some solutions in the set of the problems being separated that you wouldn't consider if you automatically bundle them together the way a lot of climate justice authors argue. All right, so there's surprisingly little conflict between solutions of the poverty and climate problems. The last thing I want to say has to do with this notion of injustice. Because when you read the popular press nowadays about the climate problem, you read a lot about different national leaders and whatnot talking about injustice out there and how the solution has to be just. And this is just a selection of old and new quotes about people talking about how it would be unfair for the U.S. to carry the whole burden and not India and China. China saying that it's unfair to have China do it because we did the whole problem, and India saying the same thing. And the question is, this is unfair. That means there's an injustice done, and there needs to be justice to right it. But the question is, who was actually unfair? Who was unjust? What entity was unjust? Now, it's my understanding of the climate justice literature that it's primarily about individual responsibilities, individual damages. We're worried about people, what people need to do, and what's their responsibility. But those quotes that I just shown you and the stuff that you read in the press is all about national responsibilities. What is a nation's responsibility? In what sense does a nation have a responsibility in this arena as opposed to an individual? And how can you reconcile these things? There are, of course, concepts of national justice and national responsibility. And if it is individuals that carry the responsibility, then what quantity carries the responsibility with it? If you want to think about it, what is the particle that transmits a responsibility across the generations and from one individual to another? Is it citizenship? The fact that my ancestors moved here from Romania, does that in any way get me off the hook? Or once I sign the papers and become a U.S. citizen, I've got the same historical responsibility as every other American, all right? Is it DNA? In other words, is it the fact that I'm of European ancestry that carries the responsibility, and that being Chinese, of Chinese ancestry, somehow gets you off? Or if I'm of Romanian ancestry, which I am, then does that get me off because Romanians were slow to develop? Or is it wealth? Is it the fact that we're wealthy? And I would argue that the most sensible way to think about this is that it's individuals and their wealth that carry the primary responsibility. And the primary need for justice resides there. Wealth brings with it advantages to the individual that owns it, but it distributes the damages to everyone else. Wealth also carries with it the historical legacy of robber baron roots, and wealth is promiscuous, traveling all over the world. So $1 in a Chinese rich guy's bank account carries the same historical legacy, I would argue, as one in my stock portfolio. All right? So I think it's probably individuals and wealth that is the transmitter. With that said, there are probably some national concepts of justice and responsibility that apply here. For example, I think most of you would agree that it would be unjust to the government of China as a nation to prevent it from developing the infrastructure of the good life for its people. So, for instance, a one-time allowance for the infrastructure of the good life, emissions allowance for the infrastructure of the good life, at the national level might make some sense. But otherwise, I think we want to think about nations as being composed of individuals, and of wealthy individuals in poor countries bearing the same responsibility that you do, and poor individuals in rich countries bearing little responsibility. So that's all I want to say.